It's one of the great stories of modern science. A young woman befriended a group of wild chimpanzees in the African rainforest. Because of her discoveries, everything we thought we knew about chimpanzees and ourselves was turned upside down.
If you look into the eyes of a chimpanzee, you know you're looking into the eyes of a thinking, feeling being.
Well, when you watch chimpanzees play, adults with humans or chimpanzee children, infants playing with one another, there's a real joyfulness and love of life that you can see.
This is the story of our closest living ancestors and what we thought they would teach us about ourselves. But it is also the story of a tragedy that occurred in the heart of Tanzania. A tragedy that has called into question so much of what we appear to have learnt about chimpanzees and us. On May the 15th, 2002, Rukia Sadiki set off to meet her husband. She was with her niece and her baby daughter, Mayasa. It was a route they had taken many times before from their village, through Gombe National Park to Lake Tanganyika. What they didn't know was that on that day they were being followed. The attacker snatched the child and dragged her into the jungle. Mayasa's body was found in a tree. She had been partially equal. Rukia Sadiki had known the killer all his life. Today he is still at large and capable of striking again. His name is Frodo, and he's the most famous chimpanzee on the planet. He's 27 years old, and throughout his life, he's been studied by scientists and filmed by TV crews. This tragedy shocked the world. The press said Frodo should be put down, but others claimed it was just natural behavior.
Frodo killed a human infant, something which we'd been predicting would happen for a very, very long time, because chimpanzees are hunters, and although at Gombe their favourite prey is monkey infants, human beings are just one other kind of primate.
But this was more than just a human tragedy. It has raised fundamental questions about chimpanzee research and what these animals have taught us about the origins of human behavior. The saga of Frodo began even before he was born. It all started back in 1960 with a young 27-year-old woman.
When I left school at 18, my friends, almost all of them went to university. We couldn't afford it. So it was my mother, and she said, well, why don't you do a secretarial course, and then you can get a job anywhere in the world.
Jane Goodall became secretary to the famous paleontologist Louis Leakey. Precisely because she had no preconceptions about these animals, Leakey asked her to study the chimpanzees of Gombe by the shores of Lake Tanganyika in Tanzania.
I remember the first day I arrived at Gombe, going along the shore of the lake in the little boat. And I looked up at the hillsides with the thick valleys of forest in between. And I remember thinking, how will I find the chimps? And I felt so tiny. A young girl out on her own in the forest. The chimpanzees ran away from me for weeks and weeks and weeks. They're very conservative. They'd never seen a white ape before. They were horrified.
But the solution to her problem was closer than she thought.
One chimpanzee, David Greybeard, actually came to my camp, and he found some bananas. And then he came back. And then sometimes out in the forest, I'd meet a group of chimpanzees, and if David was there, instead of running off, he just calmly sat because he knew me by now. And so the others, you know, they were poised for flight, and they looked at him and, well, she can't be so dangerous after all. But that was after 5 or 6 months.
David Greybeard helped Jane think of a way to win the chimps' trust. She decided to feed them.
I had the idea of putting bananas out on a regular basis because of David having stolen some. And it was he actually who brought the others. They followed him. And it took a while, but eventually the whole group became used to my camp and would come wandering along looking for bananas.
By feeding the chimpanzees, Goodall was able to observe them closely. And it was then that she witnessed something so extraordinary. It was to take Gombe from complete obscurity to scientific legend.
I remember so vividly walking through the long, tangled vegetation. It had been raining, and I suddenly saw a black shape hunched over this beautiful golden colour of a termite mound, and I peered with my binoculars, and it was a male chimp with his back to me, so I couldn't tell who it was. And I could see his hand reaching out and picking pieces of grass, and then apparently poking them at the heap. And until he moved away, I didn't realise it was David Greybeard, and then he turned and looked at me. And I still couldn't quite believe it. I went up to the heap, I picked up a grass, I pushed it in a hole. The termites clung on.
What Goodall had seen was something we thought only humans could do. An animal creating and using a tool.
It was just so exciting. I mean, at that time it was thought that humans and only humans used and made tools. Louis Leakey sent a telegram back saying, now we must redefine man, redefine tool, or accept chimpanzees as humans. Because up until that point, we humans had been defined as man, the tool maker.
Over the months and years, Goodall saw many more examples of tool use. They fished for ants, used leaves as sponges to soak up water, cracked open nuts with a wooden hammer. It seemed humans would have to be redefined. But at first, the idea that an animal could use a tool was so shocking that the scientific community did not believe her.
Many, many scientists, when they heard that this young girl with no degree of any sort had apparently observed chimpanzees using and making tools, they simply disregarded it. And there were a few who said, well, she must have taught them, which was, I mean, that would have been very clever of me, I must say.
Then other scientists started to see chimps using tools throughout Africa. It led to an even greater insight. different populations of chimps had different tools. Even when these diverse groups of chimps had the same tools, they used them in different ways. So not only could chimpanzees use tools, they had the beginnings of another trait we think of as solely human.
It was pretty obvious that chimpanzees had their own kind of primitive culture.
Chimpanzees in one location use one kind of tool, and in another location use another kind of tool. So that meets the minimal criterion for culture.
Every group of people in the world has its own culture. At its most basic, it's the ability to create and use tools in their own way. This knowledge is then passed on to the next generation.
There's some human cultures, for example, that use knife and fork, like this culture, and other cultures that use chopsticks to get food to their mouths. Those are cultural differences, and in chimpanzees too. You can see some group of chimpanzees eat termites with long sticks, and others use very short sticks and eat them one by one. And those are cultural differences in the chimpanzees.
So chimpanzees used tools. They had the beginnings of culture. Suddenly it seemed as if our closest relative really was almost human. But many scientists still believed that we were fundamentally different. After all, they said, we can do one thing chimpanzees are physically incapable of. We can talk. Then in 2002, one scientist made a remarkable discovery.
I happened to be in my office while the chimps were being fed, and I heard them vocalizing in food barks. Chimpanzee food barks, which are a natural vocalization that chimpanzees make when they discover food or in anticipation of receiving food. And I said out loud, actually, "Oh, they must be having grapes." And then I was surprised at that and came into the feeding area to see, and in fact, they were being fed grapes.
Sarah Boyson wondered whether chimpanzees gave different calls for different foods. If so, it suggested that chimps had a form of language.
Yeah, those are good, aren't they?
So she devised a test to find out whether her chimpanzees meant what they said.
Sit over there.
First, Boyson and her assistant recorded the calls chimps made when they were given food.
Hey, Steve, come here.
Then she played these calls to other chimps, like this female Sheba. She was given 4 photographs of foods.
Sheba.
Sheba had to choose the photo that matched the sound.
Green beans, excellent.
This call is for oranges.
Good job, Sheba. Excellent. All right. Good job, Sheba.
Sheba and the other chimps were consistently able to choose the correct picture to match the sound.
Excellent.
So could the calls be like words?
Well, it may mean that there is some kind of meaning to the vocalizations they make. They could be similar to a word. There'd be word-like, perhaps.
Daryl.
So chimpanzees made calls that other chimps understood. They could have a primitive form of language.
You want one? Okay, here. Those are lemon drops. Those are good, aren't they? More?
Now there was just one last barrier between us and chimpanzees. It's what makes us truly human, knowing that other people think. Children begin to understand this very early on. It's called theory of mind. This experiment in Germany was designed to show whether children know what other people are thinking. First, the little girl played with two objects.
Magst du es auch mal probieren?
Ich geh mal raus, was schauen, ja?
One experimenter left the room. The girl played with a third object.
Tschüss, Alina.
Most children want to play with toys they haven't seen, so they assume other people do too.
Genau, ne? Das ist ja lustig. Ganz bestimmt.
When the experimenter returned, she asked for one of the toys, but she didn't say which one.
Alina, guck mal. Guck mal da.
So if this child has theory of mind, she should give the experimenter the toy she knew the experimenter hadn't seen.
Dankeschön.
We see one especially startling kind of skill that children at this age are already showing. And that is that even though there are sort of three objects there that the person might be focused on, three of them this person might want, they know which one of those three the person wants.
The experiment showed that very young children have the beginnings of theory of mind. Since we can't talk to them, it's harder to tell if chimpanzees have theory of mind too. But at the Max Planck Institute, they've designed ingenious experiments to find out. Chimpanzees are very hierarchical. A subordinate chimp won't even go for the banana when a dominant chimp is around. In this experiment, a student hid a banana. The subordinate chimp could see it, but the dominant couldn't. Did she know the dominant couldn't see the banana? The subordinate chimp understood that the dominant chimp couldn't see the fruit, so she snatched it. But to have theory of mind, chimpanzees have to know what other chimps know. This time, both chimps saw the food being hidden. The cage door was closed, so that the dominant couldn't see what the subordinate saw. The student moved the food. The subordinate stood a chance of getting the banana, because she knew that the dominant chimp did not know where the food was.
In the experiments with chimpanzees, they know whether the other one has visual access or not to a piece of food. So it's very similar to the study with children in the sense that they know what the other one can and can't see, and in one variation of the experiment, they know what the other one saw a moment ago.
So does this mean that chimpanzees can understand what other chimps are thinking?
There's absolutely no question but that chimpanzees understand the needs and the emotions of other chimpanzees and respond correctly. They can even understand the needs of another human being. So clearly they do have theory of mind.
Jane Goodall's work utterly transformed our understanding of chimpanzees. Because of her pioneering research, we have finally found a creature that had traits we thought were uniquely ours. Tool use, culture, language, theory of mind. The final proof of our close relationship came from genetics. We share over 99% of our genes with them. But then scientists wondered, if chimpanzees are so similar to us, could they tell us something about ourselves? It was then we discovered that they have one last trait that seemed to make them very human indeed. They had a darker, more deadly side. Like everyone else, Jane Goodall had always thought that chimpanzees were peaceful vegetarians, enjoying nothing more alarming than the odd ant, until she stumbled upon the truth.
I always remember sitting up on the peak and seeing a chimpanzee followed by another couple climbing up into a tree, and they weren't very close to me. And I was peering through these second-hand binoculars, which was all that we could afford back then. And it was David Greybeard again, and after a bit it became very clear that he was eating a piece of meat. And the female who was with him was reaching out her hand and begging. It was just very exciting because we thought that chimpanzees were basically vegetarians and perhaps consumed a few insects.
And so we discovered these so-called vegetarians are hunters. They're particularly fond of baby monkeys.
You get incredibly excited when you watch chimps hunting, and all of the sympathy that otherwise one might expect to feel for the poor prey just goes out the window because you identify so strongly with the chimpanzees. They are so intent and they're so excited. The passion that they feel is just so extraordinary. Then they settle down into eating it, and you have a time to reflect on what is actually happening. And you realize that this is a very extraordinary behavior because there is far more meat eating going on in chimpanzees than there is in any other species of primate than humans.
Goodall's discovery was a revelation. But then she found out they did something else that was far more chilling. They killed their own kind. In the 60s, the group that Goodall studied split into two factions, Kasakela and Kahama. The rivalry between the two turned into a bloody civil war.
It was in January of 1974 that we first had this report of one of the males in Kahama, Hody, being attacked by a group from Kasakela. He jumped down from the tree, he ran, but they got him. Somebody got a foot, somebody got a hand, they pinned him down, and then they beat on top of him. The attack went on for more than 5 minutes, and by the time they let him go, he could hardly crawl away. And Hody was never seen again.
One by one, the males in the Kasakela group killed every male and some of the females in their neighboring group. Only a few years before, the victims had been their constant companions. In total, a third of all male deaths at Gombe were at the hands of other chimpanzees. Richard Wrangham's student, Martin Muller, recently discovered just how brutal chimpanzees could be.
It was in August of 1988, so we were with our 10 males, and they were patrolling, and we could hear them screaming and very excited, and we heard them pounding. It sounded like they were pounding on the ground. And we realized that our chimps were with a chimp from the neighboring community that they had killed. And the pounding that they were doing was on his body. They were still pounding on his chest. And it was horrific. The whole front of the chimpanzee was covered with 30 or 40 puncture wounds and lacerations. The ribs were sticking up out of the rib cage because they'd beaten on his chest so hard. They'd ripped his trachea out. They'd removed his testicles. They'd torn off toenails and fingernails. And it was clear what had happened was that some of the males had held him down while the others attacked.
Slowly, it dawned on scientists that chimpanzees were not like us just because they could think, reason, and use tools. They were like us because they could be cruel.
There is a sense in which this looks sadistic. The joy, this is kind of hard to take, because again, it's got horrible echoes of what happens with humans at times. The males who attack, they do seem to take a certain joy in the attack, the drinking of the blood sometimes, or the biting, gripping with the teeth of the skin on part of the arm, and then rearing the head back, taking the skin with it and tearing it all the way round. They look as though they're in a state of intense excitement and maybe joy.
Chimpanzees can be described as sadistic because they have theory of mind. They know when they're inflicting pain. Not all animals have this ability.
You cannot have cruelty in creatures that don't have empathy, ironically enough. For example, a shark can do a lot of damage and can hurt you very terribly, but I don't think a shark can be cruel. It doesn't have the brains to understand what the effect is of its actions. Now, chimpanzees do have that kind of understanding. Chimpanzees have empathy and sympathy, and so, as a result, they can also inflict pain on purpose, I think.
There is only one other animal on the planet that has a similarly dark side: human beings.
I think the sad part is that having observed that sequence of events in which the larger community completely annihilated the smaller one and then took back the territory, that just made the chimp seem even more like us than I'd ever thought before.
Because of these revelations, one scientist put together what would become one of the most important theories about the origins of human behavior. Since we are so closely related, Richard Wrangham believes chimpanzees can tell us about our past. And what chimpanzee aggression seems to show is that we, like them, are programmed to be violent. Wrangham calls his theory the demonic male hypothesis.
The demonic male hypothesis is one that just responds to some very dramatic observations. We only know of 2 mammals in the world in which males make deliberate attempts to go out and kill members of neighboring groups. And those 2 mammals are chimpanzees and humans.
It's called the demonic male hypothesis for a reason.